I'd like to thank everybody for showing up this afternoon, particularly to hear a talk about an event that took place more than 55 years ago. You would think that we really wouldn't be talking about this event at all, but I want to catch you up with some of the things that have happened quite recently about the JFK assassination. So when Donald Trump was running for the Republican nomination, you may have remembered that he brought up the fact that perhaps Ted Cruz's father was associated with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. During that summer, Lee Harvey Oswald was leafleting pro-Castro leaflets, and he hired a few people from the unemployment office to help him. One of those two people he hired had never been identified, and so all of a sudden Donald Trump was talking, maybe it was Ted Cruz's father. Now, he got that from the National Enquirer. They ran this story. And now, of course, it was completely ridiculous because Ted Cruz's father was an anti-communist. And so there's no way he would have been leafleting with Lee Harvey Oswald, and we know that those two people came from the unemployment office. So the whole story was ridiculous. He probably got that, the National Enquirer probably got that from Roger Stone. Roger Stone was somebody who worked for Donald Trump, who was known for doing all sorts of crazy stunts over his life. I don't know if you know Roger Stone. But a few years ago, he came out with this book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. And I read this book for my book. I read this book, and I can tell you it's dreadful. And it's really embarrassing that somebody published it that it actually made the New York Times bestseller list. I just don't know who would buy it. It was really dreadful. But this is nothing compared to what Barack Obama said. And this is an article from The Nation magazine, which is a leading left-wing magazine. And basically, at a speaking event, Barack Obama was asked, "What happened to your progressive foreign policy?" And his reply was, "Do you want me to end up like JFK?" Now, this is a long-standing trope of the left. JFK was killed because of his foreign policy. He was going to end the Cold War. He was going to withdraw troops from Vietnam. He was going to have rapprochement with Cuba. It was going to lead to world peace, and so therefore he had to be killed. The people on the left love this stuff. It's all nonsense. It's all progressive nonsense. In fact, JFK was a Cold Warrior. He was an aggressive Cold Warrior, and in fact, the speech that he was going to give in Dallas that afternoon was a speech where he was bragging about his defense budget, increases in his defense budget, new defense projects. His whole speech was bragging about what he was doing, what he was spending on defense. And this continues. I don't know how many people here get Netflix, but Netflix ran a 4-part series this year about Robert Kennedy's run for the presidency in 1968. And it's the same thing. So the part of the whole premise of the story is Robert Kennedy was going to end poverty, he was going to fix race relations, he was going to end the war in Vietnam, he was going to be, the second coming, and therefore he had to be killed. It's the same, and we have to go, and then the last episode of the series was we have to now go and find the conspiracy. What's the conspiracy? So it's this a favorite thing on the left, and the fact is that the left could never get over the fact that a Castro-loving communist killed JFK, and an Israel-hating Palestinian killed RFK. And that's the truth, and the left has never been able to get over it. So we're still talking about the JFK assassination, but why did I write this book? Well, my last book was on my trip from being a left-wing activist in Toronto to being a Conservative Party campaigner, and I thought that it might be a good idea for that book to write about how I was a conspiracy believer in the JFK assassination, and then I moved to believing there was no conspiracy. I thought that would be a very, very good metaphor for my politics, or my change in politics. And my editor was Terry Glavin, And we were talking about this, and he said, okay, well, you know what, why don't you go and write? Just write what you want to write. And so I ended up writing 3 chapters on the JFK assassination, and he really liked what I was writing. He thought it was a lot of fun. But in the end, we decided not to use these chapters. We decided that my first book should start with 9/11, and it was really too much of a stretch to talk about the JFK assassination. So those chapters were just sitting around doing nothing. Then, back in November 2017, I'll tell you just going back a year, I don't know if you remember, but there was it was time for a whole bunch of documents to come out on the JFK assassination. And Donald Trump had to make the decision about what to release, what not to release. And in fact, in the end, a lot of stuff was released. Hundreds of thousands of new documents were released, but a few were held back in the end. And so in November 2017, the Fifth Estate on the CBC ran a documentary called the JFK Files, The Murder of a President. So a little over a year ago. And I watched this documentary, and it was horrible. It was really, really awful. And you can watch this on the web, it's all there. But it was produced by Brian McKenna, who was a longtime producer at JFK, at CBC. And he got into a lot of trouble years ago when he produced The Honor and the Valor about the crimes of Canadian pilots in World War II. But he made besides being a whole really bad documentary, I caught him in a very, very big error. So he opened up this new documentary with a new document, an expose of a new document that had been released in all these documents. It was dated 2 days after the assassination, in which FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover is quoted as saying, quote, "The thing I am concerned about is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." The documentary here presented this as new evidence, confirming the belief by many people that Lee Harvey Oswald was the U.S. government's patsy in JFK's death. That's what they're saying, that Oswald was the U.S. government's patsy. Unfortunately for the CBC and for the Canadian viewing public, that document wasn't new at all. In fact, it was not written by J. Edgar Hoover. It was written by Walter Jenkins, an aide to President Lyndon Johnson, and it was published 39 years ago by the House Committee on Assassinations. And if you read the whole document, basically the thrust of the document is, look, we're faced with possibly another world war, if people believe the Russians are involved with this assassination. So let's do what we can to cool down the public and get the real facts out. And as they said, the public needed to be settled down, and there was no intent to do anything about finding a patsy. So the CBC got this wrong. And I decided I'd write an article about this. So I ended up writing an article, had it published. And so there I was, while I was doing my research, I figured out that Brian McKenna had not just done this documentary, but he had done 5 more. Total of 6 documentaries on the JFK assassination, going back to 1977. And so I started to look at them, or whatever I could see, because I couldn't get all of them. But I started to watch some of them, and I started to research. And I found out that he had donated all his papers to Concordia University in Montreal. They have this sort of gambit where if you donate your papers, you get a big tax credit, and it saves you a lot of money. So I made an appointment, and I drove to Montreal to look through 2 boxes of material on the JFK assassination in Brian McKenna's archive. And I get there, and there's 2 boxes, and it was incredibly disappointing. He had clearly not given them the best of his stuff. A lot of it was old newsletters of the assassination. There were some interesting newspapers from the 1960s, the Montreal Gazette, the Montreal Star. He lived in Montreal. But for the most part, it was disappointing, but there were a few gems in there. And what I want to show you, this is a memo. In 1983, the CBC was going to air a major documentary on the assassination. And right before it was going to air, one of the associate producers, Maxine Sidran, sent Brian McKenna a memo. This is the memo here. You probably can't see it. It's okay. I'll tell you what's in it. But it's a memo that attached a, quote, a strange message from a Ouija board session that communicated with President John Kennedy. Included in the memo, the second page of this memo, was a transcript from a 1976 session where they asked Kennedy, "Who killed you?" And Kennedy answered he answered Carsland. So they asked him, "Well, who again?" And he said Carsland. And they asked, "Who is Carsland?" And he said it was the Secret Service. The memo here, if you read it, claimed that, quote, "The people who used to take part in these sessions often had better than average results." John Kennedy also told them the truth would come out soon via an informant, and that he had been killed because of, quote, "secret plans to take over the country." The text of the session was attached to this memo, quote, "with no editing," because that is what you do if you're a good researcher. Welcome to the world of the Fifth Estate. Now, unfortunately for McKenna, even though Kennedy told him that he was going to reveal the secret of what had happened to him, it didn't make it in time for the documentary. So I ended up writing a whole chapter about the CBC and the JFK assassination. Then I sat there and I had 4 chapters on the JFK assassination. And so I said, maybe this is a book. Maybe I'll write a whole book on the JFK assassination. And so that's how this book came about. Now, what I want to do now is I want to take you back in time. And I'm going to take you back to 1976. March 1976. Anybody here alive in March 76?
I wasn't.
A few people know. So I was 18 years old in March 1976. I was at home watching TV late night, and I want to show you exactly what I saw. I don't know if anybody wants to move up closer because we only have one small speaker for this, but I think you'll find this to be a very interesting video, if we can get it to play.
That's it for now. Thank you very much for being with us.
Okay. So that video was very important to me. It was the first time, important to a lot of people, that was the first time the Zapruder film had been shown on national television. The Zapruder film had been bought by Life magazine, and one of the, when Abraham Zapruder sold it, he wrote into the contract that Life magazine should not exploit the unduly horrible nature of the film, and so Life decided that they would never show the film. So they published a few frames in their magazine, but the film was never shown. The frames were published in the Warren Commission report, but nobody saw the film, and this was, of course, a bootleg copy that Robert Roden got. So this caused quite a furor when this was shown. But let me just add something. Everything you saw in that 20 minutes was wrong. Every allegation made was completely wrong. I'm not going to go through all of it, it's in my book, but the parade route was never changed. And the reason that people thought the parade route was changed was because in one of the newspapers they published a diagram of the parade route, and it was a long parade going over for many, many miles, so that short turn on Elm Street, the diagram was too small to show the turn onto Elm Street. So people thought it had been changed, but in the words describing it, that turn onto Elm Street was there. I want to talk, though, about one thing about Ralph Schoenman, the guy with the beard. Does anybody here know who Ralph Schoenman is? Ralph Schoenman. Do you know who he was? Anybody? Ralph Schoenman was the chief private secretary to Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher. And And he played a huge role for Bertrand Russell. In fact, so much so that if you go and read, for instance, the best biography of Bertrand Russell by Ronald Clark, there's a whole chapter on Ralph Showman. And what Ralph Showman did was he pushed Bertrand Russell into crazier and crazier anti-American left-wing positions. He controlled access to Bertrand Russell so that even Bertrand Russell's friends couldn't see him. And before Bertrand Russell died, he disavowed Ralph Showman. It was on page 1 of the New York Times. And then he wrote an 8,000-word essay about how horrible Ralph Showman was, which was published shortly after Bertrand Russell died. But I want to talk about one thing he said. He talked there about Jack Ruby wanting to go to Washington. Well, that was true. Jack Ruby did tell the Warren Commission that he wanted to go to Washington. He repeatedly said, take me to Washington, I can't tell you the truth, I want to tell you the truth, I got a lot of things to say, you got to get me out. And one of the things that, he references the Warren Commission Volume 5 in that thing, and he's right, it's all in Volume 5. But he stops, he doesn't tell you why Jack Ruby wanted to go to Washington, and it's all in the testimony. Jack Ruby was a paranoid schizophrenic, and I wanted to show you this. I don't know if you could see this ad. This was an ad from the Dallas Morning News, the morning of the assassination. It was just a big ad, full page, welcome to Mr. Kennedy. It was accusing him of treason in the way he had been working on various issues. At the bottom of the ad was the American Fact-Finding Committee. It was signed by Bernard Weissman, chairman. So Jack Ruby saw this ad on the Friday. Bernard Weissman is a Jewish name. Jack Ruby was Jewish. And so after the assassination, he was really bothered by, oh my God, were these people involved? Was Bernard Weissman involved? Were Jews involved in the assassination? And so he saw at the bottom, it was Post Office Box 1792, Dallas 21. He went to the post office. Jack Ruby, on the Saturday, went to the post office to see if he could find out who is this guy, Bernard Weissman. Of course, they wouldn't tell him. All he could see was there was a post office box there. It was full of mail. But he was bothered. He was very, very bothered by that. So then Jack Ruby goes and kills Oswald on the Sunday. Well, back then, if you can remember, the John Birch Society was very, very active. The John Birch Society was a far right-wing organization. They're very, very anti-Semitic, and there you have Jack Ruby, a Jewish man. His real name was Jacob Rubenstein, killing Oswald. So to the people like the John Birch Society, well, maybe this was the Jews. It was the Jews behind the assassination. And so Jack Ruby, who was very, very, very sensitive, thought, now because of me, because of what I did, they're blaming the Jews. And so that got him very, very, very upset. And see, he believed, this is what he told this to the Warren Commission, quote, through certain falsehoods that have been said about me to other people, the John Birch Society, I am as good as guilty as the accused assassin of President Kennedy. He worried, quote, that he would be used as a scapegoat, and there is no greater weapon that you could use to create some falsehood about some of the Jewish faith, especially as the heinous crime such as the killing of President Kennedy. So the reason he wanted to go to Washington was he wanted to actually personally tell Lyndon Johnson that a new Holocaust was coming. Quote, this is a quote right from his testimony, I want to say this to you, the Jewish people are being exterminated at this moment. Consequently, a whole new form of government is going to take over our country. I know I won't live to see you another time. Do I sound sort of screwy in telling you these things? Ruby added that, quote, now maybe something can be saved. It may not be too late. Whatever happens, if our President Lyndon Johnson knew the truth from me. That's why he wanted to go to Washington. It wasn't to talk about any conspiracy. It was to warn Lyndon Johnson about a coming Holocaust. Now, one more thing about Ralph Showman. Remember he said that his psychiatrist had examined him in the mid-60s, and Ruby had told him that he was part of a conspiracy. Well, I wanted to research that, so I got out the London Sunday Times article that Ralph Showman was quoting from, and indeed, in 1965, while Ruby was in prison, he was examined by Dr. Werner Tutor of Loyola Psychiatric. It was a Chicago-based psychiatric hospital. But Shulman was quoting from a newspaper article, London Sunday Times, which I found, but I wanted to get the complete psychiatric report that Tutor had written. I had trouble getting it because the London Sunday Times article spelt his name wrong. But I found it. I found the article, I found his report, and in fact, Ruby did tell Dr. Tutor there was a plot to kill Kennedy. But what was the plot? Dr. Tutor, Jack Ruby told the good doctor, go get this book. This book, Who Killed Kennedy by Thomas Buchanan, tells you the whole thing. He says one of the other inmates here in the psychiatric prison has this book. I could borrow this book and give it to you. It has all the details. This was a book published in 1964 before the Warren Commission reported, and it blames the right-wing oil interests for killing Kennedy. So Ruby had no idea of any conspiracy. He read books like other people read books. That's what Shulman was talking about. So, going back to the Zapruder film, now I was fascinated by that head snap, right? I really wanted to find out was the Warren Commission, did they know about it? What did they think about it? Why did his head go backwards if it was shot from behind? So the first place I went was to the library at Dawson College in Montreal, and of course, they didn't have very many books on the Kennedy assassination, but they basically had a few conspiracy books. And so the first book I got was this book, Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment. This was a massive book, it was published in '66, it was a massive book, sold over 1 million copies, it was translated into many languages, came out in Britain. Mark Lane was a lawyer who he wanted to represent Lee Harvey Oswald before the Warren Commission. He was denied, and he went on to make quite a living writing books like this. So this was the first book I went to. And so he didn't really address, well, I read this book, and what he said was, the most interesting part was that the autopsy, x-rays, and photographs of Kennedy were confiscated by what he called federal police agents after the autopsy. So I want to know what happened to the autopsy, x-rays, and photographs. Well, this book was written in 1966. It was now 1975, so 9 years had passed. So I went back to the library, I went to the periodical indexes, I went to the New York Times index to sort of catch up to what had been going on. And I found out that, in fact, the Kennedy family was in possession of the autopsy, x-rays, and photos, and that in 1972, they allowed 2 private doctors to examine them. One was Dr. John Latimer, who was a urologist at Columbia University in New York, and the other was Dr. Cyril Wecht, who was forensic pathologist who was the chief coroner of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. So I went and I found their addresses, I wrote them both letters, and in a couple of weeks I got these big packages from both doctors with all of their articles. And so I was very interested in what they had to write. I was particularly interested in reading Dr. Wecht's articles, because Dr. Wecht was the former president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. He was probably the foremost forensic pathologist in the United States. And here was his article from 1974, The Medical Evidence in the Assassination of President Kennedy. And here's a quote from it, and quote, "The available evidence, assuming it to be valid, gives no support to theories which postulate gunmen to the front or right front of the presidential car. The wound in the president's head, as evidenced by the autopsy photographs and x-rays, can only have been fired from somewhere to the rear of the president." So here's the world's best forensic pathologist saying the shot was fired from behind. Who might argue with him? The question is, why did his head go backwards? Well, Dr. Latimer wrote it was probably because of a neuromuscular spasm. It's not that uncommon. And so, again, if it didn't bother Cyril Wecht, why would it bother me? And I do want to show you, I'll try to show you this and see if it goes on. Where did the headshot come from? Let's see if I can, okay, what you're seeing here is the shot of the headshot in slow motion. I'm going to play this again. But what happens here, the frames are numbered. In frame 312, he's hit. 313, you see the explosion, his head goes forward. Yeah, right? So, and then you see his head go backwards. So we'll keep on playing this just so you can see what happens here. He's hit the next frame. His head goes forward slightly. The explosion in the right part, and then his head goes backwards. So what's happening here is the bullet is hitting the back of his head, pushing it forward. There's an explosion out the right front of his head. All this material flows out that way, helping to push his head backwards. In addition, he had a neuromuscular spasm, and because of the back brace, his body went backwards. So that's, there's nothing mysterious about the movement of his head. Now, I want to tell you, all three people in that video, Robert Groden, Ralph Showman, and Dick Gregory, went on to disgrace themselves after that show. So here's Robert Groden. He was the one who showed the film. Well, he went on to testify in the O.J. Simpson trial. He made a career of himself telling people that all the autopsy, x-rays, and pictures in the Kennedy case were faked and forged. And he testified in O.J.'s civil trial that one of the pictures, in the O.J. Simpson trial, they found footprints of somebody who was wearing Bruno Magli shoes. And the prosecution found pictures of O.J. Simpson wearing Bruno Magli shoes. And so the O.J.'s defense got Robert Groden to testify the pictures were faked. The picture was faked. The problem was that the prosecution then found 30 other pictures, making it impossible to fake all these pictures. So Robert Groden really lost a lot of credibility. And today, if you want to see Robert Groden, here he is, selling his wares in Daily Plaza in Dallas at a table. He's there every weekend selling his books and magazines. He's now in his early 70s. So that's what he does. Ralph Showman went on to write a horrible book called The Hidden History of Zionism, where he blamed Israel for everything. There's just a bit from the New York Times where Russell disavows American ex-aid. He went on to become a 9/11 truther. He's still alive today. You could probably find him on the internet radio somewhere with his 9/11 truther stories and conspiracy stories. And Dick Gregory, well, here's just one little thing. I have many things about Dick Gregory in my book. Here's from 2006. Dick Gregory blasts insane racist system in America. And he says here, malt liquor is made by white beer companies but only sold in black neighborhoods. And you don't get suspicious? They put a thing in it called manganese. And once you get so much manganese in you, you will kill your mama. But they've got you to believing that's normal for you to act that way. So he was also a 9/11 truther, and in fact, Dick Gregory used to appear on Alex Jones's show to talk about 9/11. So, going back to that show, that show that I showed you actually got the U.S. Congress to reopen the investigation. So in 1977, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was formed to investigate both the assassination of Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy. And this investigation focused on the science. So they used all the latest scientific tools they could. They did photographic tests, they had a forensic pathology panel, they did new ballistics, they did handwriting analysis, fingerprints, you name it, and guess what? Every test they did showed that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. Just as they were finishing up, in 1978, they wrote a rough draft of their report saying there was no conspiracy, Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. Somebody said, you might want to check the motorcycles who were in the motorcade, they have a communication system with headquarters. It's on something called a dictabelt. And one of the researchers said, you may want to go to the dictabelt from 1963. Perhaps one of the motorcycles' microphone might have gotten stuck during the assassination, and maybe it might have recorded the sound of the assassination. So why don't you go check that dictabelt? This is right at the end of the investigation. So they hired a Boston firm, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, to analyze the dictabelt tape. And the scientists came back a few weeks later and said, you know what, I have found several impulses that I think are gunshots, and I think that there is a fourth shot fired from in front, which would prove a conspiracy. So it's right at the end of their investigation. So the chief the chairman of the committee told the doctor, he said, well, you know what, are you sure about your findings? Because I would like to put you on national television and you'll be the one to tell the American people there's a conspiracy. He said, well, so you backtrack a bit. He said, well, maybe it's a 50% chance that there is a second gunman. So he testified, and they decided that wasn't good enough, so they hired a new firm to come in and analyze this. And these two new scientists did some more tests, and they came back and said, you know what, there's a 95% chance there is a shot from the grassy knoll. And they said, yes, there is a fourth shot, and there was two gunmen. And so the House Select Committee on Assassinations had to change their report at the last minute. Here's the New York Times. Assassination panel's final report backs theory of plot on Kennedy. So they had to conclude that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. So this was back in 1979. I was sort of going into MBA school, and I got the House Select Committee's final report, and I was troubled by the fact that all the evidence pointed to Oswald, and yet here is this acoustic evidence saying that there was one shot fired from the front, and that shot missed. And that shot was only fired from 30 yards away. How could a gunman fire a shot 30 yards away, only one shot, and miss? I said, that seems a little thin to me. Anyways, I went on to school. The Department of Justice sent the tape on to the National Academy of Sciences, and they hired a panel to investigate this tape. Now, while they were working, Gallery magazine, which was a competitor to Penthouse, Playboy magazine back then, published, back then magazines could publish sort of records, these plastic records that you could play in your turntable. So they published a record of that dictabelt in Gallery magazine. And this rock musician from Ohio, Steve Barber, early 20s, bought this Gallery magazine, and he started playing this record on his turntable. Now, you can't hear the shots on this record because they're supposedly impulses. You can't hear them. But he kept on playing it over and over and over again, and all of a sudden he could make out the voice of a sheriff in the Dallas County office talking about where to position men. He said, that's strange. Why would, in the middle of the motorcade, they're talking about reacting to the gunshots? He said, this recording is actually occurring after the assassination. So he wrote a letter to the National Academy of Sciences saying, here's what I'm hearing. Have a look at that. And they reported back in 1982, and they said, you're right. This dictabelt was recorded at least a minute after the assassination, and those impulses are not gunshots, and so there's no evidence of a second gunman. So there we are in mid-80s, no evidence of a second gunman. How are we doing on time? What's the time?
It's 5, 2, 3.
Okay, I'm going to try to wrap this up. I got some more. So, so after this, you think that would be the end of it? Like, okay, enough, there's no evidence of conspiracy. Well, in comes Oliver Stone. And I want to tell you the whole story of Oliver Stone. It's a sordid story, but I'm going to tell you briefly. And we're going to go on to, this is Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison was the district attorney of New Orleans in the 1960s. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald lived in New Orleans in the summer of 1963, and he was involved in leafleting for Castro, as you saw earlier. And so right after the assassination, there was, obviously it was like, maybe there's some leads in New Orleans. And so he was the district attorney of New Orleans, and he started to investigate a few of the leads for the FBI in 1964. One of the leads was this lawyer. There was this lawyer who was in hospital the weekend of the assassination. His name was Dean Andrews. He was a big, overweight lawyer. He was played by John Candy in the JFK film, but he was a big, overweight lawyer. He had pneumonia, and he was in hospital under sedation the weekend of the assassination. And he's watching this on TV, in and out of sleeping. And all of a sudden, on the Saturday, he calls his secretary. He says, I've just been called by this guy who comes to see me on a regular basis to bring me clients, and he wants me to fly to Dallas to represent Lee Harvey Oswald. It's this guy, his name is Clay Bertrand, called me. He wants me to represent Lee Harvey Oswald. The next day, Oswald was killed, and so that sort of let him off the hook, but he started to embellish the story about this guy, Clay Bertrand, who'd come to see me. And in fact, Clay Bertrand had come to see me in the summer to represent some gay kids, because he worked on a lot of gay cases. And guess who came with Clay Bertrand on one of these visits was Lee Harvey Oswald. And so Garrison went to investigate this, and they couldn't find this Clay Bertrand. They just couldn't find him. Just couldn't find him anywhere. And that lawyer testified before the Warren Commission. And so that was one lead. There was another lead. The weekend of the assassination, there was another guy in New Orleans who was a convicted felon, a drunk convicted felon, and he's watching the television, and he hears that Lee Harvey Oswald, when he lived earlier in his life, when he was a teenager in the 50s, he had been a member of the Civil Air Patrol, which is sort of like a teenage group, you know, where it's like not the Boy Scouts, but it's like a military group for teenagers. And this guy, Jack Martin, he knew that one of the people he knew was this guy, David Ferry, who had also been in the Civil Air Patrol. And David Ferry liked guns, and he wondered, were they in fact related somehow? And so he called up Jim Garrison and said, you know, this guy, David Ferry, might be involved, because he knew Lee Harvey Oswald when he was 16 in the 1950s. So Jim Garrison arrested David Ferry, and David Ferry was actually had an alibi. He was driving that weekend to Galveston near Houston to go ice skating with some of his friends. He was also a gay man, and he had been fired from Eastern Airlines as a pilot for illicit activity with a teenager. So that was the end of those. Those two leads went nowhere. But in 1966, Jim Garrison was reading Mark Lane and all these people, and he was on a plane with Senator Russell Long, and Russell Long told him, you know, this Warren Commission stuff is all crap. And so Jim Garrison went back home, he ordered the 26 volumes of evidence, and convinced himself that there was a conspiracy, and that New Orleans was the key. So he went out and I'll reinvestigate those two leads. And so the question was, he went back to Dean Andrews, who had told him that story about this Clay Bertrand character, who had been with Lee Harvey Oswald. Who was Clay Bertrand? They couldn't find him. And they went back to look for Clay Bertrand, they couldn't find him. And then it clicked. He said, this Clay Bertrand, he was gay, he spoke Spanish. Who do I know in New Orleans is gay and speaks Spanish? And he said, oh, you know what, it must be this guy, Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw was a gay businessman in New Orleans, in the closet. Garrison knew him and said, this is the guy who must be Clay Bertrand. Now, Clay Shaw was a World War II hero. He had worked for General Thrasher in World War II organizing logistics for D-Day. And he had gotten 3 medals from 3 different countries for his work in World War II. He moved to New Orleans, he started the Trade Mart, he was a very successful businessman, and he retired in the mid-60s. He had a fair amount of money. He retired to write plays and to restore properties. And so Jim Garrison felt, this is the guy who was, had been with Lee Harvey Oswald. And so he picked up Clay Shaw for questioning. And of course, Clay Shaw knew nothing about anything, because he was just an innocent guy. And then the other guy, David Ferry, who had gone ice skating that weekend, who was also a suspect, happened to die. He died. He had a brain hemorrhage, and so Jim Garrison decided, well, they're all related, and this guy, they're all connected. And he decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to arrest Clay Shaw. And he arrested Clay Shaw for conspiracy to assassinate John Kennedy, with David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald. And the case took 2 years to get to trial, and it ruined this man. This man basically was ruined. He had to spend his whole life savings on his defense team. And you know, back then there was no Google, no internet, so we had to hire a lot of investigators to go and investigate all of the leads coming out of the prosecutor's office. And eventually they came to trial in 1969. The trial lasted around 23 days, and Clay Shaw was found not guilty within 45 minutes of the jury going out. There's a picture of Clay Shaw with the not guilty verdict. It was, the New York Times said it was the biggest legal miscarriage of justice in American history.
That was a CIA agent.
So, and now, right after the not guilty plea, Jim Garrison charged him with perjury the next day. And that took another couple of years before Clay Shaw got that quashed, and then he died of cancer. So his life was ruined, died of cancer, an innocent gay man. Now, Oliver Stone decided to tell us to do a movie. What did he do? He decided to tell this story. And he made Clay Shaw the guilty one, and he made Jim Garrison, that horrible prosecutor, the hero. And if you watch the movie, you'll see that the underlying plot is a homosexual plot to kill the president. And in fact, here is a gay magazine from the 1990s, The Advocate, Oliver Stone's JFK, Pinko Homos, Ice the Press. It has to be one of the best cut lines ever. And so I tell the whole story in my book, both of Jim Garrison and the story of Oliver Stone, and it's a disgrace with Oliver Stone to re-victimize this hero, this innocent gay man, and all he wanted to do was write plays and restore properties. So that's my presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Was the spot where the shots were taken identified?
Yeah, it was from the Texas School Book Depository, and behind Kennedy, they found the gun there. They found
So what
three.
distance is that?
The first shot was around 55 yards, and the last shot was around 85 yards. Very close. Yes.
Were they not able to tell the point of entry of the bullet to clearly identify that he had been shot from the rear?
Well, that's a good question. One of the tragic mistakes the Warren Commission made was they never examined the autopsy X-rays and photos. The Kennedy family didn't want them to become public, and so Earl Warren decided we're not going to look at them. Now, what he should have done back in 1964 was get a panel together of forensic pathologists, examine them, and come out with a detailed report, and that would have ended a lot of the suspicions, and they didn't do that. We had to wait till the
But there was an
1970s.
autopsy, was there?
What?
There was an autopsy.
There was an autopsy, yes.
So they would have shown the wound, the exit wound.
Well, the other than every forensic pathologist who has looked at the autopsy pictures and X-rays and photos come to the same agreement that the shots came from behind. The evidence is clear. Yes.
Can you just remind me, I know they found Oswald in a movie theater, but I mean, how did they know where to look for him and why?
Okay, well, basically, Oswald shot the president. He ran across the floor, it was the sixth floor of the Texas School Book Depository. He ran across the floor, he hid the gun between some cartons. It was a book depository. These were all school book cartons. He hid the gun between them, walked down 4 flights. He was actually accosted by a policeman. He walked down 4 flights, a policeman was running in from the outside, but Oswald's boss happened to be there, and he said, okay, Oswald's okay, he works here. He walked out, he got on a bus to go home. The bus got stuck in traffic. He exited the bus, he took a taxi to his rooming house. He lived in a rooming house. He was separated from his wife. He didn't have the taxi stop at the rooming house. He had the taxi go past the rooming house because he wanted to see if the police were there. Police weren't there. So he got out, he walked back to his rooming house, changed his shirt, got his pistol. He had a pistol. He got his pistol, put on a jacket, went out. Where he was going, nobody's really quite sure, but along the way, he probably, there was a policeman who was patrolling the area around 9/10 of a mile away. He was walking and the policeman was there, and probably Oswald made some sort of suspicious, maybe he changed direction when he saw the cop, but the cop decided to stop him to question him, and Oswald shot him. And there were a lot of witnesses who saw him both shoot him and, of course, empty the gun, empty the cartridges, and he ran off. They tried following him, they couldn't really quite follow him, but he went onto a main street where there was a lot of movie theater and a lot of shops. And by this time there were police cars running all over the place. They had heard that somebody had been shot. And so every time there was a police car that ran by, he went into the vestibule of the shoe store. He looked suspicious, and the shoe store manager said there's something funny and followed him when he left. And Oswald ducked into a movie theater without paying. And so the manager of the shoe store called the police, and they came to the theater and arrested him, and he tried to kill one of the policemen there, but they carted him off.
Did you say a pistol or a rifle was used?
For the assassination, it was a rifle, a pistol for the shooting of the policeman. Yes, Carol?
Oswald is working all alone.
Yeah. Oswald was working all alone. I think and the question is, why did he shoot Kennedy? I think that when he was in New Orleans in the summer of 1963, remember there were a lot of attempts on Castro's life that summer. The U.S. was trying to kill Castro. There were a lot of attacks on Cuba. In mid-September, there was an article, September 9th, there was an article in the New Orleans Times-Picayune about a speech that Castro had just given. And in that speech, Castro had said, if these attacks on Cuba don't stop, American leaders themselves will not be safe. It's pretty certain that Lee Harvey Oswald read that article. He was really into Castro. He had a picture of Castro on his mantle in his apartment. He was really, he loved the Cuban Revolution, and he was probably incensed by the fact that the Americans were trying to kill Castro. And I think the reason he killed Kennedy was as a blow for the Cuban Revolution. Yes.
Could you help us, like, you hear contradictory ideas that Oswald was a great shot, and then he was a horrible shot, like in the movie he made it when Magus draws that thing, what do you call him? Can you help us figure
Yeah,
that out?
so the question is, was Oswald a good shot, a bad shot? Well, he was a sharpshooter in the Marines. So yeah, he was a pretty good shot for an average person, probably a okay to good shot in the Marines, but he was a sharpshooter. And in the film, one of his colleagues in the Marines say, well, Oswald wasn't very good because he would get a lot of misses, which we called Maggie's drawers. Well, the problem was that towards the end of his enlistment in the Marines, Oswald had really stopped caring. He was thinking about going to Russia. He eventually defected to Russia, stopped caring, and so he didn't do quite as well on his rifle test towards the end of his Marines day. And that's why the whole Maggie's drawers. But he was a pretty good shot. I'll tell you a funny story. Several years ago, I had this argument with this guy, ex-Marine. He had written a book. He decided to write a book. Could Oswald have killed Kennedy? Could he have made those shots? I'm in the Marines, or I was in the Marines. Could he have done it? He wrote a whole book about it being impossible. And he sent me the PDF of his book, and I read it, and I said, you've done all this research about Oswald. You don't even know that he was a sharpshooter in the Marines. He says, no, he was never a sharpshooter in the Marines. I said, well, no, of course he was. And I sent him the evidence that Oswald was a sharpshooter. I said, how could you do all this research, write a whole book about this, and not know what he qualified as? So there's a lot of, he was a pretty good shot, good enough to have killed Kennedy.
So with your findings now, there's no more secrets?
Well, here's the question is, are there secrets? Here's what's happened. And when the Warren Commission finished its work, it was a presidential commission. So when all their documents went to the National Archives in the States, the rule for presidential commissions is that documents remain secret for 75 years. It wasn't Earl Warren who decided this. That was the general rule for presidential commissions. 1965, the mayor of Iowa City, Iowa, wrote a letter to Lyndon Johnson saying, why are all these documents secret? It's not right. And Lyndon Johnson went to Earl Warren and said, what do you think about releasing the Warren Commission documents? And Earl Warren says, you know what, release them. And so Lyndon Johnson changed the rule for the Warren Commission. They started releasing Warren Commission documents. Of course, they were going to keep some documents secret that had to do with national security, but they started releasing documents. Then in 1967, the Freedom of Information Act came in, and people could actually sue to get actual FBI reports, not just the Warren Commission stuff, but FBI, CIA, and a lot of stuff started coming out that way. So there was a lot more stuff coming out than people realized. But of course, any document that had a source, a secret source, or something related to foreign intelligence had to remain secret. Now, in that short film, he talked about all those CIA documents that are secret. Well, there was a list of 52 documents about the CIA and Lee Harvey Oswald. Every one of those 52 documents he mentioned there is now open. You can look at them, they're all online, and there's nothing in those documents. Now, after Oliver Stone's film, the parting shot of his film is, why are the documents secret? And so this was George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush was in office, and he set up the Assassination Records and Review Board. And then Clinton became president, and it started its work under Clinton. They took 4 years. They put actual historians on the board, and their mission was, let's declassify every document we could find. And they went to every agency in the U.S. government, because you have to give us a catalog of every document you have. And they sent teams in to investigate. They bought the Zapruder film from the Zapruder family for $16 million to make it a government asset. And they even went to the CIA and they said, not only do you have to release the documents, you have to tell us what every acronym is in the documents, and you have to tell us who all these sources are. You have to give us the identification, and the only way you cannot give us these documents is to appeal right to the president. They appealed on several occasions. Every appeal was turned down. So everything came out related to the assassination. Now, when they were defining what an assassination record was, they decided, let's use an expanded definition. So they said, if an FBI agent worked on the assassination in 1964, then every one of his files was considered to be an assassination record, even if they had nothing to do with the assassination. So they had an expanded view of what a record was that had to be released. The only records that they did not release, and which Trump is still keeping secret, are records that to this day have sources that are secret sources that are still alive, or some sources which might embarrass the U.S. in terms of national intelligence. But all the documents on the assassination themselves have been released. The only ones not released are those that are non-assassination related that have these sources. So there's nothing in the documents that are still secret. There are documents that are secret that we need to see. Those are the documents that are held in Russia, documents held in Belarus because Oswald was a defector to the Soviet Union. There are secret documents in Cuba, and there are secret documents in Mexico. Those are the secret documents that would be interesting to see. But the reason I want to see the Russian documents and the Belarus documents was because the Soviet Union had a campaign in the 1960s to try and convince Americans that the CIA was behind the assassination. So I want to see more about what the Soviet Union did. And that's all in my book. David.
Congratulations on an excellent book. I thoroughly appreciated it. 2 or 3 quick questions. First of all, were you surprised by how long-lived the controversy about the headshot movement has been, given what I'd always understood to have been a fundamental of forensic analysis, that the exit energy will tend to push a head back or whatever. The other thing, it just, I guess, has to do with the Kennedy family's own arrangement in bringing in 2 physicians. It surprises me that one of those would be a urologist, when presumably they have the whole scheme to choose from. And that almost seems to invite questions about how cozy that arrangement was. And then the final issue, just in defense of the CBC, you mentioned the Ouija board issue. I understand that it was a peer-reviewed Ouija board.
Okay, So Dr. Latimer was the urologist that examined the autopsy. Actually, he was the first person allowed to examine it in '72. In fact, I spoke to his son in this book because I wanted to get a clearance to use a diagram from one of his reports. He was, well, he wasn't a forensic pathologist, but he was a very, very good ballistics guy. He was very, in private life, he was a gun nut. He really knew guns. And he ended up in his life doing a lot of experiments on the ballistics side of the Kennedy assassination. He was a terrific researcher. Very, very good. So he was first, Dr. Wecht was second right afterwards. And they both agree on everything, just about. On the headshot, I'm astounded, given the fact that every forensic pathologist says that he was shot from behind. It's not, if there was one forensic pathologist who said differently, okay, maybe we could hang the hat on that, but everyone's been unanimous. The evidence is overwhelming. I don't know, it still goes on today, people still debate it.
Thank you.
Are you familiar with that, I just found out about this and I've been following this forever, mortal wound theory, that the agent, Hofstedt, with an AR-15 shot him and the Secret Service didn't want to, can you comment on that one?
Yeah, there was a theory, and there's an Australian documentary and a book that was published about this theory that right out, you can see pictures, the people, the Secret Service people had AR-15s, you can see pictures in the motorcade rushing to the hospital with their AR-15s drawn. And so somebody wrote a book about, well, you know, maybe one of those Secret Service guys accidentally hit Kennedy. You know, he was the one who killed him. And it's just ridiculous because that's not what the Zapruder film shows. And in fact, there's no witness who would say that's
Someone
what
would see
happened.
that, yeah.
Nobody saw that.
Yeah.
So it's one of the many crazy theories.
I have a question. This is such a very complex topic. Is there somebody who orchestrated all this? Is there a theory as to who was the brains behind the whole event?
Look, there's so many theories out there that you know, again, there's everybody. This is the problem that people, particularly on the left, the problem on the left is that after Kennedy's death, you know, how could you accept this meaningless communist, Castro-loving guy killed Kennedy? There had to be a bigger meaning to Kennedy's life. So that's why people say, oh, you know, he wanted to destroy the CIA. It must have been the CIA. He wanted to get out of Vietnam. It must have been the military-industrial complex. It must have been. So people are looking for a big. He was going after the mob. It must have been the mob.
General Lewis.
I would say the only unanswered question in my mind about the Kennedy assassination was there somebody in Dallas who was egging him on to do this in the final few days?
So he did it himself because it's ideological.
Yeah, Oswald thought he was destined for greatness. That's what he thought. Earlier that year, he tried to kill General Walker, who was a right-wing general in Dallas, and he just missed. And he thought he was destined for greatness, but nothing was turning out right, and this was a chance to be great.
It's funny how people don't know that about Walker, that he already tried this on someone else, you know.
He already tried this.
Yeah.
So with the publication of your new findings, you're in danger, and so are we.
No, you know, I spent a large part of my life arguing with JFK people on Facebook, and they're really crazy, and they're very angry with me.
It's okay, Fred's wearing Kevlar.
And they're very angry. I was on Steve Bacon show, The Agenda. They're very angry. Like, why did they put me on? When people have accused me of being a CIA agent. In fact, when I was 20 years old in Montreal, I was accused of being a CIA agent for one of the articles I wrote back when I was 20. They wonder, why did you write this book? Are you being paid? Did you write the book for money? Of course, there's no way I would write this book for money because I don't make any money. It's quite amazing.
Was he arrested for attempting to kill the general?
No, he fired one shot, and he missed, although he almost got him, and he hid his rifle and went home and told his wife. He'd actually left his wife a note, what to do if he was arrested. And she kept that note. And so it was a detailed note of what to do if he was arrested, and he told his wife, and so she knew that he had tried to kill Walker, but no, he was never arrested, nobody knew.
That's after he was out in the military.
I'm sorry, what?
That's after he was out in the military.
Yeah. After he left the military, right after he left the military, he defected to the Soviet Union. right? He lived in the Soviet Union for a few years. Yeah, they sent him to Minsk to work in a radio factory, and he discovered, like many millions of other people, that life in the Soviet Union was horrible, and wanted to come back to the States, even though he hated America.
Yeah. That's what American haters supposed to do.
How many people defected from the U.S. to go to the Soviet Union?
He said, are you sure?
I made a note of that.